Lasker was the ultimate pragmatist, the ultimate practical chess player. He actually knew how to pinpoint his opponent's weaknesses and take advantage. So, the first practical player.
The rematch would be the first time Lasker had to defend his title. This time, in Moscow. This time around, he beat Steinitz in an utterly dominant fashion. Lasker won 7 of the first 11 games. The other 4 were ties. Steinitz won games 12 and 13, after which Lasker won 3 of the last 4 games to retain the title. In a published letter to the press, Steinitz cited a multitude of issues surrounding his accommodations in Moscow, including overheated rooms, the lack of fresh air, and the unavailability of cold water and ice. However, Steinitz also claimed, in response to the question, "Why am I beaten so badly?" he writes that Lasker was the greatest player I have ever met. Perhaps the greatest that ever lived. Fast forward to 1907. Lasker was studying for his doctorate in mathematics, and thus had little time to practice chess. His challenger was Frank Marshall, from the United States. His home would eventually become the famous Marshall Chess Club in New York City. Despite Lasker's studies, he crushed Marshall and held him winless throughout the competition, with games in New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, and Memphis. It was a battle marked by Lasker's employment of the Queen's Gambit and Marshall's use of the French defense. Marshall, in his mercurial style, would note that tedious play aimed at wearing down my opponent is averse to my nature. Lasker had no such reservations. Lasker won the first 3 games, then scored 1 win and 7 draws in games 4 through 11, before winning the last 4 games for a final score of 8-0, with 7 draws. A year later, Lasker would defend his title a 3rd time, this time in Dusseldorf and Munich, against fellow German Siegbert Tarrasch, one of the most influential chess theoreticians and popular writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Game 14 in the match was a nail-biter. With 119 moves, it held the record for the longest game in a world championship for years. Ultimately, Lasker easily held on to his reign, beating Tarrasch 8-3 with 5 draws.
The match against Tarrasch was conceptually a very difficult match. So the fighter was playing the theoretician, if we can put it this way, and it could have been a different turn of the events and a different turn of the chess history had Tarrasch won this.
In 1910, Lasker defended his title twice. First, in a controversial match that ended in a tie with Austro-Hungarian chess master Karl Schlechter, a strong but sometimes unambitious master. The players agreed to a best-of-10 match, with 5 games in Vienna and Berlin, respectively. The shortened match was the result of London, St. Petersburg, and Stockholm all failing to participate in raising stakes for an even longer match. Unlike Lasker's earlier title wins, this championship was dramatic and well played by both players. In fact, 8 of the 10 games were draws. Schlechter won Game 5. The next 4 games were also draws. In the 10th and final game of the championship, Lasker had to win in order to tie the match and retain his title. In a letter to the New York Evening Post, Lasker wrote, "The match with Schlechter is nearing its end, and it appears probable that for the first time in my life, I shall be the loser. If that should happen, a good man will have won the world championship." However, Lasker came back to win the 10th game and retained his title. Later that year, Lasker was challenged by Russian-born Frenchman David Yanovsky. The entire match was held in Berlin, and in terms of the score, Lasker beat Yanovsky in the most one-sided World Championship match in history. The final score was 8-0, with 3 draws.
Emanuel Lasker was world champion for 27 years. I mean, the name Lasker must have been known by intelligent people and knowledgeable people, cultivated people in general, even if they knew little about chess.
A true sportsman, chess wasn't the only game that Lasker was interested in. He was a first-class bridge player and invented a game called Laska, which is similar to checkers. But it's his role as a ferocious defender and a pioneer of chess strategy and psychology that made him a star. Emanuel Lasker successfully defended his world championship title 5 times.
Will anyone beat Lasker's record of standing on the chess throne for 27 years? Honestly, I don't think so. He's really the first universal player, so again, he was equally good in everything, but above all, he was a fighter.
War puts a lot of things on hold. Families, plans, and on occasion, the World Chess Championship. But that's not the strangest part of José Raúl Capablanca's rise to fame. Capablanca was a personable Cuban chess prodigy who could play chess before he could read. He had been winning tournaments since he was 13 years old. By the time he was 22, Capablanca played with great intuition and fluidity. But his true object of attention was the endgame. He was ready to compete for the world title, challenging world chess champion Emanuel Lasker. That was in 1911. The problem was the 2 players couldn't agree on the format. Lasker was unwilling to play the traditional first-to-win 10 games method. The arguing grew so intense that the men stopped speaking to each other. A few years later, they reconciled at the 1914 St. Petersburg chess tournament. They finally agreed to terms for a championship match. Lasker came from behind to win that event in May. And then, only a few weeks later, Gavrilo Princip would assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. World War I had begun. It was reported that Emanuel Lasker lost his entire fortune in Germany during the war, and was even detained for a short period. There would be no World Chess Championship for another 7 years. In 1920, negotiations between Lasker and Capablanca resumed, mainly through several correspondences. Chess critics in London criticized both men so harshly that it became a strain on their friendship. Lasker resigned his title in the dispute over match conditions and named Capablanca his successor. But Capablanca stated, "I would much prefer to play for the title, regardless of the outcome of the match." The chess world agreed and didn't accept Lasker's gesture, despite Lasker declining in health. Eventually, the 2 players agreed to play in Havana, Cuba, for the 1921 World Chess Championship. The format was best of 24. The first man to win 12.5 points, or 8 games, would be declared the winner. Capablanca had been undefeated in chess competition for 5 years running by the time the match would start. The match was marked by both players' competing theories of the Queen's Gambit decline. The difference in age and sharpness of tactical ideas would prove to be Capablanca's advantage. But the championship ended strangely. Lasker resigned from the match after 14 games, citing poor health as the reason. Despite resigning the match, Lasker stated he was convinced he could not have beaten his opponent. Capablanca was officially the new world chess champion.
Capablanca was a reflection of all of his predecessors in terms of being aggressive, being creative, being a genius, as some would call him, but also being so technically sound that he would be willing to take games into the endgame and win with just the smallest of advantages.
Our first proper certified bon vivant. He loved the good life. Stories about mistresses, about romances, about wearing fine suits and going in Fifth Avenue, all that stuff. And he was, I think, the first world champion who really properly enjoyed himself.
Capablanca wrote of chess in his book, Lecciones Elementales de Ajedrez. Chess serves, like few other things in this world, to distract and momentarily forget the worries of daily life. Capablanca would not have to defend his title for 6 years. It was September 1927 in Buenos Aires. Capablanca was the huge favorite. He had already beaten Russian player Alexander Alekhine in other tournaments and not lost a single game to him. But Alekhine was no stranger to the game or the pressure that comes with it. Born into a wealthy Russian family, his older brother taught him to play chess. By age 16, he was considered one of Russia's top players. Alekhine's preparation checklist was complete. He had raised the required $10,000 for the match, he had studied Capablanca's games, and learned to play in his style for this match. Alekhine even physically trained for the competition. All that was left was to play, and preparation showed. The meeting between Capablanca and Alekhine was one of the longest formal world chess matches in history. And though Alekhine won, he later admitted that even he was surprised by the victory. It was the first of many matches to come for the World Championship that would be won by players who had never before defeated their opponent.
Alexander Alekhine, as is appropriate for someone who follows Capablanca, was the tormented one. He never seemed to find peace in his life. Even when I watch his games, you feel his pain somehow.
During the course of the match, a decree granting Alekhine's request to be a French citizen was granted. He started the match as a Russian and would win the championship as a Frenchman. The two masters made an informal agreement to play a rematch sometime within the next year, but it would never happen because Capablanca failed to raise the necessary $10,000. Yefim Bogolyubov, a Russian-born German player, then challenged Alekhine. Calling Bogolyubov a more serious challenger, Alekhine accepted, despite Bogolyubov's failure to raise $10,000. The two agreed to a public match held in 6 different cities in Germany and the Netherlands, with Alekhine receiving $6,000, regardless of the match's outcome, and his challenger receiving the balance of the monies raised for the match. Bogolyubov had beaten past world champions Emanuel Lasker and Jose Capablanca, but he could not beat the reigning champ. It would be 5 more years, 1934, before Alekhine would have to defend his title again by facing Bogolyubov for a second time. Not only was the challenger the same, but so was the agreed-upon format. It was the only championship ever held inside Nazi Germany.
Many players before him could be boxed in or defined by a style or an approach. You could not box in Alexander Alekhine. His truly well-rounded approach to the game showed that the future best chess players in the world could not deny or neglect any skills that they would need to develop to be the best. Alexander Alekhine is maybe the first true super grandmaster that existed.
In those days, there was no strict